Well, hello. Today we are looking at a possible ethical basis for increasing access to healthcare, maybe even making healthcare universally accessible. I want you to think about first some of the things we've learned previously. First, we've learned that a great many people do not have access to our healthcare system in the United States, or at least do not have consistent access through some kind of healthcare insurance. Maybe 50 million people lack healthcare insurance, and that means their primary form of access to the system is through the emergency room, which is terribly expensive and terribly ineffective. And we know there are lots of deaths that are unnecessary simply because people wait too long to get access to the system and only get it through the emergency room. It's very difficult to make access to health care universally available because it costs so much. And that's a problem, a sign of crisis, according to Mappus and DeGracia, because not only do we expend an incredible amount of money for healthcare services, much greater than similar services cost in other countries, but also a very high percentage of our total productivity, our gross domestic product, is dedicated to meeting just our healthcare needs. Now, we also learned previously that a primary goal of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act as it's called, is to increase access to healthcare by the expansion of insurance programs for folks. There will be an expansion of Medicaid, which will be a government-provided insurance program or an expanded government-provided insurance program for those who are poor. But also, there is this so-called individual mandate. Everyone will be required to have health insurance, either through their employers, which is where most people get health care, but about 5% of the population buys private insurance. All people who now will be required to buy insurance if they don't have it as an employment benefit. So that will dramatically increase access to healthcare. Now, the question we're addressing today is the possible ethical foundation or basis or justification for this effort to increase access to healthcare. And we're going to be looking at two kinds of justifications. One grounded in the principle of beneficence, the idea that greater access to healthcare will promote human welfare, human well-being overall. But the other grounded in justice. We'll raise the question, does justice demand, does justice require, does fairness require that more people, maybe even all people, have access to health care, certainly all citizens? Relatedly, is there a right to health care that people have? Well, those are our topics today. Okay, the first thing we want to do is a quick review of the relevant principles we're considering today. Beneficence and justice, two of the five principles we've been dealing with throughout this class. You will recall that beneficence is a positive principle that requires action. It requires us to do something. First, to protect people from harm, like sickness or injury, to remove harm or injury by caring for people when they are sick or injured, and then finally, actions to promote their overall welfare, like promoting better health and promoting longer life. Now, you may recall that beneficence is generally thought to be an imperfect principle. That is, it's weaker than non-maleficence and even justice. It allows for a certain amount of discretion. We aren't always required to help, but only some of the time. All right, next let's consider the principle of justice. Justice points to or refers to the obligation that we have to assure that people have or get what they deserve, that they have or get what they are entitled to. Justice means that people should be treated fairly. Justice is generally thought to be a more perfect or a stronger principle than beneficence. It's like non-maleficence in that respect. We've seen a certain amount of discretion in deciding whether or not to help people, whether or not to promote their welfare. But we don't have nearly so much discretion when it comes to matters of justice or matters of right. If people are entitled to something, if fairness requires that they be treated a particular way or get something, if they have a right to certain treatment, then we certainly do not have a wide measure of discretion in deciding whether or not to provide that benefit or to treat them in that way or to honor that right. Moreover, we've seen that justice is a fundamental principle for the evaluation of institutions, and particularly basic institutions like our economy or our government. Justice demands that the constitution of our government, its basic policies and practices, respect justice, respect human rights, respect the dignity of its citizens. Its practices and its policies must be just. It must treat people fairly. We've also noticed a close relationship between justice and equality. Justice demands, we believe, that we treat people equally. Of course, that idea, that principle, was expressed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence when he said all men, all human beings, all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, rights that are equal, rights that mean all of us should be treated the same way, treated equally in some important respect. Now, we know this relationship between justice and equality is not perfect. We've looked at the very first definition of justice that we're familiar with in Western philosophy, a definition provided by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. He said that justice requires us to treat equals equally, implying that we should treat unequals unequally. Now let's think a bit about what this idea of Aristotle's means for us. The first thing it requires is that we identify the ways in which we are equal. How are human beings the same in respects that are morally significant? And then how must we be treated equally with respect to those particular ways? How would we specify the equal treatment that's required because we are the same in important respects? Of course, we are not the same in all respects. There are significant differences among us. Now, some of those differences are not morally relevant. That is to say, they don't justify treating people differently. So we would regard race, gender, racial and gender discrimination as unjust discrimination, and probably also discrimination among people based upon their religious beliefs or other beliefs. And one of the things we're arguing about now in our society is whether people's sexual orientation justifies differential treatment. So some ways in which we are different do not justify our being treated differently. However, there are differences among us that make us morally unequal or unequal in ways that are relevant to how we should be treated. So we've given the obvious example in class with reference to the differences among students in terms of how well they perform on tests, how well they display their mastery of course material. There are relevant differences among students in that regard, and those differences justify different grades. Or similarly, we do not have a society in which everyone has the same income or wealth. We believe that people's education, their efforts, and ultimately the contribution they make to other people's welfare through their work justifies different levels of income and different levels of wealth. So, in some respects, we're the same, and that means we must have equal treatment. In some respects, we are different, Some of those differences do not justify differential treatment, and some do. Okay, now we want to think about what would be called a beneficence-based argument for the government's responsibility to increase access to health care. That is to say, an argument grounded in the responsibility to act in ways that protect people from harm, that care for them when they are harmed, and promote their overall welfare. Now, surely I think we would all agree that promoting human welfare, promoting the welfare of its citizens, is a fundamental responsibility of government. That's a fundamental reason that we have government, to make our lives better, to promote our welfare. This is particularly true with regard to those things that we are incapable of doing for ourselves, particularly when there are certain goods, certain things that make our life better off that we cannot produce or even enjoy individually. So there is this idea of social welfare or the common good. That is to say, things that are good for human beings that can only be created and enjoyed together. Things like public parks, you might say, promote all of our welfare, but those are things that it makes no sense to think of our having or enjoying as individuals or by ourselves or alone. So surely a fundamental responsibility of government is to promote human welfare, and particularly to promote our enjoyment of things that are social or common goods. Now, way back in 1983, the President's Commission on Biomedical Ethics made an argument or offered an argument grounded strictly in beneficence, in the government's obligation to promote human welfare, suggesting that the government is morally bound, or that all of us through the government are morally bound to increase access to health care. They made that argument making 3 points. First, they said that healthcare needs have a nearly unique moral significance, which is to say, when you need healthcare, the need for it is urgent. Health care obviously addresses our illnesses, our injuries, those things that on some occasions are threats to our very life. So just as life itself is a basic value, physical life is a basic fundamental value, responding to our physical needs through healthcare is a special sort of thing. Second thing they pointed to was that healthcare needs are largely undeserved. Now, surely they're not entirely undeserved. Much about our lifestyle affects our healthcare needs, but probably the vast majority of our healthcare needs are not a result of anything that we do, and certainly are not a result of anything we deserve. Because of our genetic makeup, we're more prone to certain illnesses. Because of our the environment in which we live, some of us are more prone to illness than others. Injuries happen. They're called accidents. They seem to be random. So much of the need that a person comes to have for health care is in no respect a result of their own behavior or something we could say that people deserve. Finally, the President's Commission argued that when healthcare needs arise, particularly dramatic or significant ones, it's implausible to think that individuals could meet those needs, could pay the cost for their health care strictly on their own, given that those given that health care is often very expensive. Given that our need for it is unpredictable, you can't really plan or prepare for it that well. And obviously, healthcare needs are unevenly distributed. Some people end up with a very costly cancer, or a cancer that's very costly to care for or address. Other people don't. So, for those three reasons, because healthcare needs are particularly morally significant, they arise largely unrelated to an individual's action or behavior. They're not something that people deserve, and they're very costly to address. For all those reasons, the President's Commission said that making people better off by providing access to health care is a morally demanded, morally required, morally significant obligation that society has through government. So strictly based on an appeal to beneficence, that is to say, without claiming that justice demands greater access to health care, the President's Commission argued that the United States should broaden access to health care. So, what are we to make of the President's Commission's case for greater access to health care as something morally required by the government's obligations grounded in the principle of beneficence? I think they surely make a plausible case that increasing access to health care would make people better off. Presumably, being able to go to a doctor when we're ill, being able to have our injuries treated, being able to be admitted to the hospital when we need surgery, all of those things would surely make folk better off, or greater access to those things would make folk better off. And that's true even as we recognize, when we consider things like end-of-life care and the kinds of issues raised in the Gowande article, even if we recognize that some of our healthcare decisions at the end of life result in our getting care that maybe doesn't make our lives better off, still, overall, greater access to the healthcare system, to the care of physicians and hospitals, would make us better off. Moreover, I think they are right to suggest that given the cost of healthcare, given the expense that care involves, it's unrealistic to think that individuals are always going to be able to pay those costs on their own. Moreover, increasing access to healthcare is surely consistent with our idea that the very purpose of government is to make our lives better off. The very purpose, or among the purposes of government, is to promote human welfare, and particularly social welfare, or the common good. Having said all that, there is still the age-old problem of ends and means. Right? I mean, just because you act in pursuit of a worthy end, and I'm suggesting increasing access to health care is surely a morally significant worthy end, that doesn't mean that whatever one might do in the pursuit of that end is in fact morally justified. We have to ask ourselves, would pursuing the end of greater or even universal access to healthcare involve some profound injustice? I mean, obviously, it's going to be costly, and if we're going to pay for that, we're going to have to impose greater taxes on some people, most likely on those at the upper end of the income scale who are already paying higher tax rates than others. Would that be an injustice? Would the money spent on healthcare promote human welfare better if expended somewhere else? So simply convincing us that increasing access to health care is a worthy end does not necessarily mean that that the things we might have to do to achieve that end are justified. And it raises this fundamental question, I think. Isn't government's greatest responsibility to promote and respect justice? And if we might have to commit injustice in order to simply promote human welfare, might that not be a mistake? The bottom line here is that unless the argument for greater access to health care is itself a matter of justice, unless there is some kind of a right to health care, the case for expanding access might not be adequate. And so what we're going to look at next time in our next iMovie lecture is possible arguments for expanding access to healthcare, for universal access to healthcare, grounded not in beneficence, or not simply in the idea that that would make human beings better off, as the President's Commission has done, but rather grounding the argument in an appeal to justice or in a right to health care. Is there a right to health care? Does justice demand that all people, or certainly all citizens, have better access to health care than they currently have in the United States? That's what we'll be looking at next time.